The wind howled across the basin, a mournful, hollow sound that seemed to strip the warmth from the very air, leaving nothing but the biting chill of a Dakota winter. Lynn sat rigid on the wooden bench of the wagon, her knuckles white where she gripped the side, the vibrant red of her cheongsam screaming against the desolation of the white landscape. It was a dress meant for celebration, for tea ceremonies and warm hearths, not for this vast, freezing purgatory where the sky pressed down like a gray bruise. Beside her, the man who was now her husband held the reins with hands that looked like they were carved from granite, wrapped in thick leather gloves that had seen years of labor. His name was Silas, a name that sounded like the wind through the dry grass, and he had not spoken a word since they left the small, muddy town where the papers had been signed. Lynn kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, refusing to look at him, refusing to let the tears that pricked at the corners of her eyes freeze on her cheeks. She was 19, a stranger in a land that did not want her, sold by desperation and circumstance into the keeping of a man whose face was hidden beneath the brim of a battered hat and a beard thickened by frost. The cold seeped through the silk of her dress, biting into her skin, a physical reminder of her vulnerability. Every lurch of the wagon sent a jolt of fear through her spine, a silent question of what awaited her at the end of this journey. She had heard stories of the men in these territories, men hardened by the elements, men who took what they wanted and gave nothing in return. Silas was massive, his shoulders broad enough to block out the weak winter sun, and the silence he carried was heavier than any shout. She felt like a delicate paper lantern carried into a gale, waiting to be crushed. The farmhouse emerged from the driving snow like a darker shadow within the gloom, a squat timber structure that looked as though it had grown out of the earth rather than been built upon it. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, the only sign of life in a world that seemed determined to extinguish it. Silas brought the horses to a halt with a low, guttural command, the steam from their nostrils rising in thick plumes. He climbed down, the snow crunching loudly under his heavy boots, and for a moment Lynn stopped breathing, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He walked around to her side of the wagon, and she flinched as he reached up, expecting a rough grab, a demand. Instead, he simply held out a hand, palm up, waiting. It was a calloused, scarred hand, big enough to crush hers, but it remained steady and open. She hesitated, the cold biting through her thin shoes, before placing her trembling fingers in his. His grip was firm but surprisingly gentle, stabilizing her as she descended into the knee-deep drift. He did not pull her, he merely anchored her against the wind. Leading her to the heavy oak door, he pushed it open, ushering her inside before him, a gesture that confused her as much as it relieved her. The interior was dim, lit only by the dying embers of a fire in a stone hearth that dominated the far wall. The air smelled of pine resin, wood smoke, and the stale, dry scent of solitude. It was not a home. It was a shelter, sparse and utilitarian. A rough wooden table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed in the corner constituted the furniture. Lynn stood by the door, the melting snow dripping from the hem of her red silk dress, feeling absurdly out of place, a splash of blood on a gray canvas. Silas moved past her, adding logs to the fire until the flames roared back to life, casting long, dancing shadows against the log walls. He pointed to the bed, then to himself, and then to the floor near the hearth, his meaning clear without language. He would sleep on the floor. She would take the bed. The fear that had coiled in her stomach loosened, just a fraction, replaced by a profound, aching bewilderment. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light across the floorboards and the ceaseless rhythm of the winter storms. Lynn learned the geography of the small cabin by heart, the creak of the 3rd floorboard, the draft that whistled through the chinking near the window, the way the morning light hit the cast-iron stove. She tried to make herself small, to be a ghost in this house of timber and stone, afraid that if she drew attention, the tenuous peace would shatter. Silas was a man of ritual. He rose before the sun, the sound of the door latch clicking shut the only signal that he had gone to tend to the livestock. He returned with the smell of hay and cold air clinging to his coat, eating his morning meal in silence, his eyes rarely lifting from his plate. Yet Lynn began to notice the small things, the quiet concessions to her presence. The woodpile by the stove was always replenished before the room grew cold. A heavy wool blanket, smelling of cedar, had appeared on the foot of the bed on the second night. He never touched her, never raised his voice, never demanded the duties of a wife that she had been terrified to perform. One evening, as the wind rattled the window panes with a fury that made the timbers groan, Lynn attempted to cook with the limited supplies, potatoes, dried beef, and flour. She moved tentatively, her movements graceful but uncertain in the foreign kitchen. When she placed the bowl before him, her hand shook. Silas looked at the stew, then up at her, his eyes blue and unreadable in the firelight. He took a spoon, ate a mouthful, and nodded once. "Good," he rumbled, the word rusty from disuse. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her in 3 days. The single syllable hung in the air, a bridge being built over a chasm of cultural silence. Lynn exhaled, a breath she felt she had been holding since she arrived, and sat at the opposite end of the table. They ate in silence, but the air between them felt less charged with fear and more heavy with a shared, necessary endurance. The isolation was absolute, a physical weight that pressed down on the roof of the cabin, but the pantry was running low. The realization came with a sinking dread for Lynn. It meant leaving the safety of the walls. It meant facing the world that had looked at her with such open disdain. Silas harnessed the horses early, the sky a bruised purple of impending dawn. He gestured for her to put on the heavy coat he had provided, an oversized, rough thing that swallowed her small frame but kept the biting wind at bay. The ride to town was grueling, the wagon wheels slicing through fresh drifts. When they arrived, the town was a stark collection of gray buildings huddled against the cold. As they walked into the general store, the conversation died instantly. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. The silence was loud, filled with judgment and hostility. A woman in a bonnet pulled her child closer, whispering behind her hand, her eyes darting over Lynn's features with a mixture of curiosity and revulsion. The shopkeeper, a balding man with a stained apron, did not greet them. "Silas," he grunted, ignoring Lynn entirely. "Didn't think we'd see you till the thaw." Silas placed his list on the counter. "Need flour, coffee, and rice." The request for rice made the shopkeeper pause, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Don't carry that here, Silas. You know that." The mockery in his tone was sharp. Lynn shrank into the collar of her coat, wishing she could dissolve into the floorboards. She felt the weight of her difference, the shame of her displacement. Silas did not move. He leaned forward, his large hands resting on the counter, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a low rumble that vibrated through the room. "Check the back, Miller. Check again." The threat was not in the words, but in the stillness of his posture. The shopkeeper's smirk faltered, then vanished. He muttered something and disappeared into the storeroom. Silas did not look at the other patrons. He stood with his back to them, placing himself physically between the town's gaze and Lynn, a solid, immovable wall of protection. The blizzard struck on their return, a white wall of fury that erased the road and the sky, turning the world into a swirling void of ice. The wagon was useless. The horses were blinded and panicked. Silas made the decision to unhitch them, guiding the terrified animals by hand, forcing Lynn to walk in his wake. The cold was a living thing now, seeking any gap in their clothing, stinging the eyes and numbing the lungs. Lynn stumbled, the deep snow clutching at her legs, her strength failing rapidly against the onslaught. She fell, the snow rushing up to meet her face, and for a moment she just wanted to lie there, to let the sleep take her. Strong arms hauled her up before she could surrender. Silas didn't say a word. He couldn't. The wind would have torn the sound away. He simply pulled her against his side, shielding her face with his coat, taking the brunt of the gale with his own body. They reached the cabin more dead than alive, stumbling through the door into the freezing interior. Silas moved with frantic efficiency, his hands shaking as he struck a match to the kindling. Once the fire caught, he turned to her. Her lips were blue, her tremors violent and uncontrollable. He stripped the wet coat from her, wrapped her in the wool blankets from the bed, and dragged the mattress directly in front of the hearth. He sat beside her, rubbing warmth into her frozen hands with his own chafed palms. In the firelight, stripped of the layers of fear and the barriers of the outside world, Lynn looked at him. She saw the exhaustion etched into his face, the worry in the furrow of his brow. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't a captor. He was just a man, fighting the winter, trying to keep a stranger alive. For the first time, she squeezed his hand back. He stopped, looking down at their joined hands, then up at her face. The silence that filled the room now was not one of emptiness, but of a quiet, fragile understanding. The fear began to melt, just a little, dripping away like the snow on the hearth. The blizzard eventually exhausted itself, leaving the world scoured clean and buried under 3 feet of silence. The cabin, once a prison of isolation, had transformed into a cocoon of shared survival. In the days that followed the storm, the dynamic between them shifted, the sharp edges of fear worn down by the necessary intimacy of the small space. Lynn no longer flinched when Silas moved past her. Instead, she found herself tracking his presence, comforted by the heavy, rhythmic thud of his boots on the floorboards. One evening, as the fire crackled with the resinous pop of pine, Lynn sat by the light of the kerosene lamp, mending a tear in Silas's heavy work coat. The coarse wool was difficult to work with, her needle pushing through with effort, but she was determined. Silas sat across from her, ostensibly sharpening a knife, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. It wasn't the predatory look she had been warned about, nor the dismissive glance of the townspeople. It was a look of quiet wonder, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't known he needed to understand. He stood up slowly, the knife clattering softly to the table, and crossed the short distance between them. Lynn stilled, her needle hovering over the fabric. He reached out, his hand hovering for a second before he gently tucked a loose strand of black hair behind her ear. His fingers were rough, like sandpaper against her silk skin, but the touch was feather-light. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "I've worn holes in that coat for 10 years. Lynn looked up, meeting his eyes, seeing the vulnerability there. "It is cold," she whispered, her English broken but clear. "You keep me warm. I fix your coat." It was a simple exchange, devoid of poetry, yet it carried the weight of a vow. Silas didn't pull away. He let his hand linger near her face, a silent acknowledgment of the debt of warmth they now owed each other. Spring was approaching, signaled not by green grass, but by the subtle change in the quality of the light, a shifting from gray to a piercing crystalline blue. Silas began to spend long hours in the barn, a structure Lynn had not yet entered. He would disappear after breakfast, leaving her to the quiet rhythm of the house, and the sounds of hammering and sawing would drift across the yard, muffled by the lingering snow. He returned in the evenings, smelling of sawdust, linseed oil, and iron, his exhaustion palpable, but his eyes bright with a secret purpose. Lynn did not ask what he was building. She understood the language of silence better than anyone. Instead, she began to claim the cabin more fully. She found a stash of dried herbs in the pantry and used them to season the bland venison, filling the air with scents that were foreign yet inviting. She rearranged the simple furniture to catch the afternoon sun. One night, Silas returned earlier than usual, catching her humming a melody from her childhood, a soft, melancholic tune that seemed to hang in the rafters. He stopped in the doorway, listening until she fell silent, embarrassed. "Don't stop," he said, walking to the basin to wash the oil from his hands. "It's the first music this house has heard in a generation." He dried his hands and turned to her, his expression serious. "The spring thaw gathering is in 2 days. The whole town goes. It's where they trade, where they talk." Lynn felt the blood drain from her face. The memory of the town, the stares, the whispers, the shopkeeper's sneer, was a fresh wound. Silas saw her fear and crossed the room, kneeling so he was eye level with her where she sat. He took both her hands in his, enveloping them completely. "They looked at you like you didn't belong because they didn't know you," he said firmly. "And because I didn't show them who you are. That changes. You trust me?" Lynn looked at the man who had walked through a blizzard to save her, the man who slept on the floor so she could have a bed. She nodded, a small trembling motion. "I trust you, Silas." The morning of the gathering broke with a blinding brilliance, the sun reflecting off the melting snow in dazzling sheets of white. Silas was up before dawn, moving with a nervous energy that was uncharacteristic of his stoic nature. He laid out her red cheongsam on the bed, the one she had arrived in, the one that marked her as different. Beside it he placed a heavy shawl he had traded for, made of fine, dark wool lined with fur. "Wear it," he said gently, seeing her hesitation. "Wear the red. Do not hide today." While she dressed, her fingers fumbling with the silk buttons, she heard him maneuvering something large out of the barn. When she finally stepped out onto the porch, the breath left her lungs in a rush. There, hitched to the 2 refreshed horses, was a sleigh, but it was not the rough, utilitarian transport of the frontier. Silas had stripped it down and rebuilt it. He had painted the wood a deep, lacquered crimson that matched her dress. Trimming it with gold paint he must have ridden days to acquire. It was a chariot of fire against the snow, a piece of art that screamed defiance and pride. It was a vehicle fit for a queen, not a farm wife. Silas stood by the horses, wearing his best black coat, his beard trimmed, his hat in his hand. He looked at her, and for the first time he smiled. A genuine, broad smile that transformed his weathered face. "For you," he said simply. He didn't wait for her to speak. He lifted her effortlessly onto the plush leather seat he had installed, tucking a buffalo robe around her legs. As they rode toward the town, the red sleigh cutting a vibrant scar through the white landscape, Lynn didn't feel like a curiosity. She felt like a flame, and the man beside her was the one tending the fire. The town was crowded, wagons and horses lining the muddy main street. The air was filled with the chatter of people desperate for conversation after the long winter lock-in. When Silas and Lynn crested the hill and descended into the main thoroughfare, the noise evaporated. It started at the edge of town and rolled inward like a wave. Silence. All eyes turned to the spectacle. In a world of browns, grays, and muddied blacks, the red sleigh was a shock to the senses. It was undeniably beautiful, a display of craftsmanship and care that no one expected from the recluse farmer. Silas drove with his head high, looking neither left nor right, guiding the horses to the center of the gathering near the church steps. He brought the sleigh to a halt and stood up, his presence commanding the space. The shopkeeper, Miller, stepped forward, his face a mask of confusion. "Silas? What in God's name is this?" Silas ignored him. He turned to Lynn, offering his hand to help her down. As she descended, the red silk of her dress catching the sun, the women of the town gasped, not in horror this time, but in grudging awe of the sheer boldness of it. Silas didn't let go of her hand. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded document, thick parchment with an official seal. He held it up, ensuring the town councilman could see it. "This is the deed to my land," Silas announced, his voice booming across the silent crowd. 400 acres, the house, the livestock. He turned to Lynn, his expression softening, ignoring the crowd entirely. And as of this morning, it is recorded in the name of Lynn Harper, my wife. She owns the land. She owns the harvest. He handed the paper to Lynn, whose hands shook as she took it. A murmur of absolute shock rippled through the crowd. In this time, in this place, for a woman, let alone a foreigner, to hold title was unheard of. It was a wedding gift that offered the one thing the town tried to take from her: power. The drive back to the farm was quiet, but it was the silence of peace, not tension. The sun was setting, casting long purple shadows across the snow, turning the red sleigh into a dark jewel moving through the twilight. Lynn held the deed tight against her chest, but her eyes were on Silas. He held the reins loosely, the tension of the confrontation draining from his shoulders. "Why?" she asked softly, the single word holding 1,000 questions. Silas looked at her, the blue of his eyes softened by the dying light. "Because you are not a guest, Lynn. You are not a servant. You are the heart of this place now. Without you, it's just wood and dirt. I wanted them to know that you choose to stay, not because you have to, but because it is yours." Lynn felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fur robes. She slid across the leather seat, closing the distance between them, and rested her head against his heavy shoulder. It was a bold move, one that defied the rigid boundaries they had started with. Silas didn't stiffen. He shifted his arm, wrapping it around her, pulling her closer into his side. The horses plodded on, knowing the way home. The wind began to pick up, whispering through the dry grass, but the cold could not touch them. They were no longer two strangers trapped by winter. They were partners, forging a life out of the hard earth, bound not by a sail or a paper, but by the red sleigh, the fire in the hearth, and the quiet, enduring love that had bloomed in the snow. As the cabin came into view, smoke rising steadily from the chimney, Lynn knew she was finally, truly home.